Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first program in the 10 program comparative history series called Hidden Histories, Oregon's Early Chinatowns, and Chinese Worker Settlements. My name is Jackie Peterson Loomis. I'm an historian, a professor emeritus from Washington State University, and have been working with the Chinatown community for more than 20 years. Before we begin, let us acknowledge the Portland Chinatown Museum acknowledges and honors the indigenous peoples and their descendants of the Lower Columbia and Willamette River region, whose lands in the city of Portland and our museum currently occupy. These include Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Catlemet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Witlala Chinook tribes, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and the many other Chinookan peoples who established communities along the Lower Columbia, many of whose descendants are today enrolled members of the Grand Ronde, Warm Springs, and/or Siletz Confederated Tribes of Oregon. Today's program is organized and moderated by the Portland Chinatown Museum in partnership with a number of statewide organizations, universities, historic sites, museums, and national forests and parks. Hidden History aims to provide a better understanding of Chinese immigrant history and culture and its importance to Oregon's growing Asian American population by sharing knowledge and stories of Oregon's early rural and urban Chinese settlement. It also hopes to promote a deeper understanding of the way in which professionals do history. How is it researched? How is it written? And then how is this translated to the general public? We're especially interested this time around with this series in reaching many of the rural sections of Oregon with the hope of their greater understanding and appreciation of this incredibly important and little discovered and known Chinese history of Oregon. This program was made possible in part by a grant from the Oregon Humanities Commission, a statewide nonprofit organization and an independent affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which funds Oregon's Humanities Grant Program. For 50 years, Oregon Humanities has offered programs and publications that help Oregonians connect, reflect, and learn from one another. Today's program, we're going to be learning about new work, new understandings within the Salem community to uncover this long and rich history of its early Chinese American residents. We have with us Kimberli Fitzgerald, Kylie Pine, Myron Lee, and Juwen Zhang. They exemplify the diverse directions which basically together help us to begin to understand more deeply this history. Let me begin with the biographies. Kimberli Fitzgerald serves as the Historic Preservation Officer and City Archaeologist for the City of Salem, where she has worked since 2009. Kimberli holds a master's degree in city planning and historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's degree in archaeology, cultural resource management from Adams State in Colorado. Kylie Pine serves as curator and collections manager at the Willamette Heritage Center in Salem. The museum's mission is to connect generations by preserving and interpreting the history of the mid-Willamette Valley, including the stories of the region's Chinese American community. She has an MA in Museum Studies from the University of Washington and serves on the board of the Oregon State Hospital Museum of Mental Health. Myron Lee is a retired family physician and longtime resident of Portland and Salem, Oregon. His father and grandparents were early Toisan immigrants to Portland in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and he has a special interest in the early Chinese history of the Pacific Northwest. Myron is currently a volunteer physician for the primarily immigrant population at Salem Free Clinics and mass community COVID vaccination clinics in the Salem area. Finally, Juwen Zhang is a professor of Chinese and folklore at Willamette University with his PhD in folklore and folklife from the University of Pennsylvania, the best. He's a fellow of the American Folklore Society and the current president of the Western States Folklore Society. His research interests range from folkloric identity and folkloric film to Chinese, Asian, American folklore. Following this presentation, you'll be hearing from the panelists discuss one another's work to see how best they can discern what we can learn that is new about this history. Let me now turn to our first presenter, Kimberli.
Oh, thank you. Give me 1 second. Okay, so good morning. Thank you so much for coming today to hear the history of our Chinese community here in Salem. We're all excited to be part of Portland Chinatown's larger speaker series throughout Oregon. And I am very, very happy to be here today with Kylie, Myron, and Juwen. So first I'll be sharing with you the details of the archaeology project that uncovered our Chinese shrine, which we later found to actually be a funerary table. And then Kylie will be sharing some interesting maps and photos with you. And then Myron will discuss Salem's connection to China by sharing history of early Chinese immigrants. And finally, Juwen will wrap up with a discussion of Salem's more recent immigrants and events relating to Chinese Americans here in Salem. Okay, so for those of you that may be watching from far away, to orient you, the city of Salem is Oregon's state capital and the third largest city in the state. Salem's located in the Willamette Valley, about 50 miles south of Portland. And before I jump into the details of our project, I'm going to give you a bit of background about our historic preservation program here at the city and how we started our project, which ultimately uncovered the history that I'm going to share with you about Salem's early Chinese community. So the Salem Landmarks Commission was established in 1985, and every year they present their accomplishments and work plan to our city council, and that includes goals related to historic preservation. And one of our most important goals continuing is an ongoing goal to help educate the public about our local history. And all the way back in 2016, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act, which was originally adopted in 1966. And as part of that, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation provided some direction to local historic landmarks commissions, and they encouraged us to really look at identifying and interpreting the historic places associated with our underrepresented communities. And so we have kind of a big list of those, and our project actually started with a very simple question. Well, Salem didn't have a significant Chinese community or a Chinatown like Portland or Astoria or Jacksonville, did it? Well, actually, my colleague Kirsten Strauss and I actually purposely went and started researching just to confirm whether or not we did. And in fact, what follows is the results of our research and the subsequent project. So Ben Maxwell, one of our local newspaper reporters and photographers, had written one of the only histories we could initially find about Salem's Chinese. Kylie's going to share a little bit more about that later, in the 1960s. And it was published in the Marion County History. So we were really surprised to learn that Salem had, in fact, a Chinese community. In our initial work and looking at maps, we weren't able to find any remaining buildings associated with this community. And as a landmarks commission, we sort of love buildings. We love interpreting buildings, but so we didn't quite know what to do. Our program also includes archaeological resources, and so we turned to archaeology to try to see whether there was anything remaining below the ground. So we had heard about a project out at Salem's Pioneer Cemetery. So Elizabeth Walton Potter, some of you may know her. She's iconic in our community and in the state in historic preservation. She ran the National Register program for many years. So she had written a National Register nomination in 2013 listing the cemetery. And this cemetery, just a little bit of history about that, it was originally owned by the Oddfellows, and in 1953, the Oddfellows turned over the management of the cemetery to Myron County and the city of Salem. And then the city took ownership of the cemetery in 1985, and it's now managed by the city of Salem, the Parks Department, in collaboration with Friends of the Pioneer Cemetery. And Peter Anderson, who you see pictured here, he completed an Eagle Scout project in 2011, along with volunteers from his troop 127. He organized a field survey and was able to locate 10 headstones of Chinese Americans in the Pioneer Cemetery, and he was able to verify 22 burials. So we picked up where he left off, and looking through a number of different sources, including the great database that the Friends of the Pioneer Cemetery have put together, which is available online if you're interested. And then we cross-referenced it with old registers that we had at the city, and we were able to find 111 total Chinese documented that were buried in our cemetery. And of those burials, 71% appear to have been disinterred. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, it's a cultural Chinese tradition to temporarily bury the dead, and then after a short period of time, disinter the remains, clean them, and then send them back to their original home village in China, ideally. So these in Salem, again, 71% appear to have been shipped to China through Portland or San Francisco. And they didn't typically return women or children. We were only able to verify that men were returned. 34 were unnamed. So at the end of the day, we were able to confirm that 32 appear to still be buried in the cemetery, and with 10 that have known headstones, and the remaining 22 have locations that are unknown. So our second clue was this wonderful newspaper article, and it referenced a Chinese shrine in the cemetery. This was in 1963. So again, we were able to later confirm that it wasn't a shrine. It was actually an offering table, a funerary table, but in this early newspaper article, it was identified as a shrine. And Kylie was able to find this wonderful original photo. It's of Charles Gale. He's the City of Salem Parks Department Director. And he's kneeling on the table, and he's looking at this, this tablet with Chinese characters, which we couldn't really read, but it gave us a second clue. And we still, even though we had this, we still had no idea where this feature was in the cemetery. The cemetery is over 17 acres, and the northern edge of the cemetery was a field that was managed by Myron County, and it held unmarked plots for burials of indigents and those with no families, or those who were too poor to pay for their own burial. And Elizabeth, in her research and writing for that National Register nomination, she documented that there was a little square or a little plat that was reserved for Chinese burials, for those temporary burials. And as I mentioned before, you know, the custom to temporarily bury and then disinter the remains, this was the location that occurred. And Elizabeth thought that these may have been marked temporarily with wooden headboards that were then later removed for disinterment. So because I'm originally trained as a city planner, and planners and like to establish committees, the Landmarks Commission and staff worked to establish an advisory committee to help with this project. So this committee was established in September of 2017, and it included members, representatives from Salem's Chinese American community, like Myron and Juwen, who are here today, and then also representatives from the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, the Huayin Association, and also representatives from the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office, the Friends of the Pioneer Cemetery, the Salem Parks Department, Willamette University, both students and professors, and then also the Willamette Heritage Center, Kylie. So we established goals for our project through this committee with the hope of locating the shrine, which again, we then were able to verify that it was actually a funerary table, as well as uncovering any remaining artifacts. And then we really hoped that we could develop some interpretation for the site. So luckily through this group, we connected with Rick Hiltz. He was is the manager of the City View Cemetery. He grew up across the street from the cemetery, and he recalled playing here as a child, which I thought was funny because I actually grew up in New Hampshire across from a cemetery, and I also used to play in the cemetery. So he helped us narrow down where to look. And you can see that the picture on the lower left of your screen is what he pointed out to us. So this was just a small fragment of concrete showing flush with the ground in it. It looked a lot like other kind of concrete curbing we saw throughout the cemetery surrounding many of the graves. So we were still really unsure whether this was actually the location of that, what we then thought was a shrine. So then the next step, we enlisted the help of Willamette University, Professor Pike and some Willamette students to do some ground penetrating radar non-invasive survey, because we really we were gonna embark on excavation, but we didn't want to disturb any of those unmarked graves. So then after the survey, we did embark on the excavation. To give you a brief overview of where we're at the beginning of the project, I'm going to share this short video. So yay, we found this table almost right away. I can tell you that morning I was really nervous because it's not really a great thing to be digging about in a cemetery. So I was very, very relieved. We had a great team of volunteer archaeologists, Jamie French, Eric Gleason, Jackie Chung, and also a team from Willamette University. You can see some of the team members in the upper left of your screen. It was located just 23 centimeters below the surface. And as you can see, sometime after 1963, when that photo was taken, this feature was damaged and covered over, and we still haven't been able to confirm why. However, we were able to see that it is the same feature in the photo, including the stone tablet. So we were pretty excited. We had an open house that week to share our findings and to just demonstrate some archaeology techniques like screening. And one of the most exciting outcomes of this open house was that a neighbor living adjacent to the cemetery brought us some Chinese headstones. You can see them in the lower right of your screen. These headstones were most likely discarded at the time their remains were disinterred and returned to China. And these stones were translated by Jinglin Guo. She's a member of the Friends of the Pioneer Cemetery. And this is something that I learned that I didn't know before. They would inscribe not just the names, but also their home villages on the stones. So the characters on the right hand of those stones, that's their home village. So that information proved to be super helpful to our committee, because we were really trying to determine where specifically in China Salem's Chinese came from. So this led me to the next step in our journey and my journey. I chose to go to China to complete some additional research. And I reached out to Wuyi University in Jiangmen to assist me with translation and to find a guide. I couldn't have done it without their help. Our hope was to find whether or not the remains of the disinterred Salem Chinese actually made it home. But I had a really wonderful, unexpected discovery. We found that in China, in these villages, they had similar offering tables within these villages. So you can see the two pictures on the top of your screen. These were in two different villages that I visited. And they look remarkably similar to what we have in our cemetery. So that was pretty exciting. And then the article, which you probably can't read very well, Recollection by Sui-sun, which Kylie discovered miraculously. He describes the celebration of Qing Ming at our cemetery. And this was a recollection by Ann Losner, published in 1980, and I won't read it all, but just briefly, he says, in the Chinese section, and he's referring to the cemetery, there was a large slab raised to make a table. So that was pretty exciting. So as an archaeologist, I won't show you all the pictures and go into too much detail because we don't have the time, but we embarked on a second round of excavation trying to find the base, which we dug quite a bit, but we weren't able to find the bottom. So hopefully we may get back out there and do some more excavation. But one of the key things is that our committee decided to reinstate the historic use of this, table, which we did in April of 2018. So I have another video to share with you. Our third annual celebration of Qing Ming was held again earlier this month, and we hope it will be an annual tradition moving forward. To wrap up my discussion, we've been able to do some interpretation about this, our research and the offering table in the Pioneer Cemetery. And there was an exhibit at the Willamette Heritage Center and also at the BPA lobby up in Portland. And we've installed some interpretive panels within the cemetery and also in Salem's downtown about Salem's early Chinese community. So now I'd like to turn it over to Kylie Pine, who'll be sharing with you some interesting documents, maps, and other things about our Chinese community here in Salem.
Thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate it. As Kimberly's talked about the ways we've been literally digging through archaeology to find the history of our community's history, we've also been figuratively digging through the archives with the goal of helping document Salem's Chinese American community that we know dates back to at least 1860. Finding documentation has been hard. Scholarship of the Chinese American experience in Oregon has focused on other communities, and while we can extrapolate some of that information, my goal and our museum's mission is to talk about the stories and the people from Salem and the Mid-Willamette Valley. And I think, although we're early days yet in trying to interpret some of the data that we've been finding, I think there are some unique experiences, including related to agrarian pursuits, knowing that a lot of individuals in the Mid-Willamette Valley area were involved in the culture and brokering of hops. And as Salem is the center of state government and state institutions, highlighting some of the stories of incarceration with individuals being removed from other parts of the state and brought to Salem to be incarcerated in institutions like the Oregon State Penitentiary and the Oregon State Hospital. there's kind of a lack of resources, and this really became apparent to me in one of the first research requests that I fielded in my work at the Willamette Heritage Center nearly 10 years ago. I had an individual come to the organization asking for information about Salem's Chinese community and the underground tunnels that they lived in. I was quite taken aback by that question, and it really highlighted for me both how little I had to offer in terms of resources, but also the pervasive underground narrative that was being used within our community. And that's likely a narrative that's not unfamiliar to many cities within the West Coast. So when I went to the database and went to my stacks that day to try to find some materials to share, I really came across, theoretically, one article that was written, that Kimberly referenced earlier, written by Ben Maxwell in 1961. And while it provided some information, and Ben Maxwell had the advantage of writing in 1961 and talking with individuals that lived in the 1880s and 1890s in Salem, it's also written in language that made me really uncomfortable, especially uncomfortable in sharing. So it was kind of a call to me. This experience was a call to me and a challenge that to ask how can we do better? How can we do better in identifying materials that help tell the experiences of our community's Chinese American residents? And how do we share that information with the community in a really compelling way to start changing some of these narratives that we're circulating? I'm an archivist and a museum person, so I'm going to share with you some of the documentation and sources we've found, and those documents that are informing our current understanding of the community history. One of the richest areas that we've been looking at in terms of source material has been photographs. The Willamette Heritage Center maintains a database, or maintains over 200,000 historical photographs, and through our involvement with the advisory committee on the Shrine project, we've been able to do some more digging into other repositories throughout the state, including up at the Oregon Historical Society and the State Library of Oregon here in Salem, and other local repositories. This is one of my favorite photographs. It hangs right outside my office wall, and I get to look at it every day as I'm coming in and out. And it's kind of become a metaphor for me about the work that we're engaging in as we're trying to uncover this history and dig through the archives. If you look really closely, as I did one day as I was walking through, you'll notice this individual. And what really stood out to me was the cut of his shirt and the cross-collar look, which was quite similar to a lot of the other images that we've been finding related to Salem's early Chinese American community. And as I started looking closer at the image, it became really apparent that there were a lot of individuals in this photograph. And a lot of stories that could be told if we start looking a little bit closer and spending a little bit more time digging deeper. And just to give you a really quick reference, what we're looking at, this is Salem in the 1880s at one of the famous stallion shows that they like to have downtown. This is State Street. The spired building in the background here is the First Methodist Church. And if you were to walk along the street and look to the left back here, hidden behind these buildings is the Oregon State Capitol. So as we started to look deeper and a little bit more closely at some of the sources, a lot of different materials started to show up, and sometimes in surprising locations. This is a bound version of the City of Salem's laws from 1910, and ordinance number 777 is specifically related to the regulation of Chinese and Japanese noodle restaurants within the City of Salem, among other things prohibiting minors from frequenting the businesses, but also providing instructions about how the business needed to be operated in terms of having the clear glass window and no obstruction from people walking along the streets. I find this document really interesting in that it exists. I think it shows tangible evidence of anti-Asian sentiment within the city itself at the time, but also is an interesting commentary showing that there were enough restaurants within Salem to warrant regulation. And it becomes really interesting in juxtaposition to other photographic materials and other oral histories we've been collecting that talk about a fashion amongst young Salemites in the 1890s and onwards. We have an oral history with Luella Patton Charlton, who talks about it being the popular thing to do to go downtown Salem and to eat at the noodle houses that were down in the community. So at the same time, we have evidence of pretty stringent regulations and discrimination within the legal policies of the area. We also find that the community as a whole is flocking to these restaurants. And that's an interesting concept to be sitting with in the documentation. We've also been using newspapers as one of the really great opportunities to look at the stories and flush out some of the information about what was going on in the community at the time. Sometimes those are a little depressing as we find headlines that are reflective and echoing of current events in the community today. Newspapers can also be super frustrating because they only really provide a one-sided viewpoint of the community and what's going on in the area, and need to be read with a little bit of contextualization, which we're still trying to understand too. This is one newspaper article that talks about Chinatown being condemned. We know from the article, I guess, the good part about that is understanding that Salem considered itself having a Chinatown, even though, as Kimberli's mentioned, it's been harder to trace down geographically where that community was. But it also provides some clues to us too as to why those buildings aren't in a centralized area. And knowing contextually that individuals of Chinese ancestry in this area, immigrants, were not allowed to own property and were reliant on landlords that didn't have a whole lot of reasoning to or motivation to improve the properties that they were renting out, because there was very few recourses for their tenants to say something about that. Led to situations where we had properties that were being rented out that did not have running water or sewer capacities, leading to then a long-term community program looking at health and policing in that area. So understanding the context behind these articles has been really helpful for us as we've been working through that. So as we're on the hunt for trying to find where Chinatown was in Salem and what it looked like, we've been relying on the different sources. Some of those are maybe familiar to historians doing research, things like city directories. We've been able to find a list of addresses and community businesses in the area. We've been relying on things like fire insurance maps, which may seem like an unlikely source, but they're really, really helpful in helping us put community businesses in space. These maps, if you're not familiar with them, were created to help insurance adjusters assign a rate for fire insurance policies. Lots of wooden buildings in a certain area may have a higher rate than a lot of brick buildings that are further spaced apart. But the unintended benefit of these is that they provide really detailed maps of our city, and in the case of Chinese American residents, also labeled businesses that were owned and occupied mostly by Chinese Americans within the community as well. So part of the project that we've been doing is trying to map out from that information where Salem's historical Chinatown was located. For folks that aren't familiar with the city, or maybe only get to spend their time on I-5 moving past it, the state capitol is located downtown, and the historic downtown corridor really stands between the Willamette River and where the state capitol is today in this area here. So as we've been finding evidence of through those Sanborn maps, through city directories, through other sources, kind of been keeping an informal tally of where these businesses show up in the community and how Chinatown has changed in Salem over time. We're just in the early stages in this project, and we're looking for ways to help better understand and map this information. And again, for context, the state capitol is located right here where the star is. Some other resources that have come to light as we've been looking through these include things like property ownership records. This is an abstract of title for a property in the Oaks Edition, which is in North Salem, a residential area in North Salem. And it provides some pretty tangible evidence of the anti-Asian sentiment that was existing in Salem at the time, and the ways in which the real estate market had institutionalized segregation within the legal documentation. We also see the sentiment expressed through a lot of the political literature that we've been finding within the archives at the time, including some phrases that are uncomfortably echoing of a lot of the rhetoric that's being passed around today. And we find it in things like the booster, what I call booster literature, materials put out by the Chamber of Commerce to help entice people to come move to Salem. They use terms that may seem innocuous on the surface level, this idea of an absolutely all-American city with the native-born percentages. But as you read a little bit deeper into these as well, you find information about what these writers were considering as their neighbors. Other ways we've been trying to help document and provide a little bit more contextual information about the Chinese American experience within Salem is looking through census records. I know both Kimberly and I have been keeping our own Excel spreadsheet as we go through the censuses, and they're providing an opportunity to look at who lived here, provide names to the demographic information, but also provide some demographic information to help us understand the experience as a whole. And we've been working on biographical research, and I know Myron's going to speak a little bit more on some of the individuals and profile some of the individuals in our community as well, but it's another way we've been able to tell stories of individuals, talk about people, name them, and name their own experiences. And we've been lucky to be able to find some oral histories. We're very thankful for folks like Ann Lossner, who was working as a historian in the Kaiser area in the 1980s and did a weekly column and was able to write down the memories of Suilai's son and his experience here in Salem. And we're working on finding ways to create our own oral histories, and we're continuing to collect interviews. So I'll put an all call out if anybody has connections to individuals that have a strong tie to Salem. We would love to know more, and we'd love to increase this body of knowledge by doing more oral history and more documentation. Like we did with Mr. Kwan, who was a longtime restaurateur in Salem, and who 100 years after the early residents of Salem came, also immigrated from a region very near the Pearl River Delta area. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Myron, who's going to talk a little bit more about the history of individuals within our community.
Thanks so much, Kylie. So Salem's Chinatown's been gone for nearly 100 years. The full stories of the individuals who lived here, told in their own voices and their own language, are lost. But we do know some of their stories from fragments pieced together over time. We try to honor the memory of the individuals who lived here in Salem, to honor their work, and to make some connection with the people who live here now. So who were they and where did they come from? The Chinese in Salem came in the late 1800s from Guangdong province in southeast China, working outside of the new concept of the Cantonese. They just in Guangzhou much longer than that. And just for orientation, Guangzhou's there and Hong Kong is there. They came from 4 counties, mainly in the southwest part of Guangdong province. This was the 4 counties Yup area, and they shared many of the same traditions, and they spoke the same dialect. Toisan, or Sunning, as it used to be called, was the most important of those 4 counties. It was mostly rural farm villages and small towns. Even though the Toisan people, like my family, could spend most of their lives overseas, they always had strong connections with their Toisan roots, their families, their villages, and their clans. In the late 1800s, Salem was a lot of muddy streets, raised wooden walkways, and horses. This parade in 1870 on Commercial Street was about the time that many of our Chinese individuals began arriving here. In a couple of blocks away in 1857, 60 white men per person voted their own property. About 1 in every 9 people you'd run into downtown would be Chinese. They were segregated to a 6-block area to live and own their businesses, and they were some of the worst rundown buildings in Salem. But they weren't segregated from interacting with the white society in Salem. There were day laborers, house cleaners, cooks, barbers, fishmongers, farmers, doctors, and merchants. Thousands of Chinese came to Oregon to work on the railroads. My grandfather was one of those. There was a boom of railroad building in Oregon in 1870 that lasted over 20 years. They signed up with Chinese labor contractors and were paid about $1 a day. They lived in work camps along the line, and they eventually the lines all got finished and the work gave out. So the workers moved into towns that already had some Chinese communities. They found work wherever they could in town. This is a woodcutter in front of the Marion County Courthouse. Wood was used for everything. Heating, cooking, running the laundries, steam locomotives. Woodcutters found work through one of the 2 diesel providers. They were Chinese merchants. White employers who wanted Chinese workers for clearing land or draining a field would usually use. Young men could find work as domestic servants and cooks for some of the white families in Salem. They often lived in with the family and did the bulk of the cooking, cleaning, laundry, and even some of the child care. For many families, they were indispensable. It was a chance also for some Chinese to learn English and the Western ways of doing things. So most of the Chinese in Salem were laborers. They worked on truck farms, hop fields. They cleared land, dug ditches, and built roads and canals. They built a lot of Salem's infrastructure at the time. James Chung in the center there was one of the best known laborers. He came over in 1874 when he was in his 20s. The story is that when he came to town, he put up a sign that said, "Jim Chung, he wants work and he can do everything." This turned out to be mostly true. He chopped wood, he picked hops, he cleaned houses, he sewed carpets, repaired windows. For 25 years, he worked as a porter for Henry Meyer's store. When he got older, he washed windows. This was known and liked by everyone in town, street, and never had his own place. In 1907, he was walking downtown one evening when 4 young men attacked him, apparently just because he was Chinese. Afterwards, he showed some of his acquaintances his bruises all over his torso, and his picture got in the paper, and it said that he would sue the city if he died. He recovered. In 1927, Jim Chung was 85 and he worked for 60 years as a laborer. He left Salem to spend his last days in China. 100 people came to see him off. Henry Myers said he was a fine, loyal old man, honest in his work, honest with his friends, and a good citizen. Mr. Myers had meant citizen figuratively because Chung really could never become a citizen. This is the Sung Lung laundry on the corner of Court and Liberty in 1888. There were several Chinese laundries then. Sung Lung was 31 when this was taken. He came in 1874 when he was 21. He learned to read, write, and speak English. He lived in the back of the laundry with his 3 co-workers. Like him, they were all single men in their 20s and 30s. The work of running a hand laundry was really hard physical work. You had to keep a fire burning all day to heat the water and the irons, and the risk of burning down the place was pretty high. But it was good work, and you could save up money. Sung Lung competed well even with the big Salem steam laundry, which advertised no Chinese employed here. Sung Lung never married, and his laundry was still going in 1905. So some Chinese were cooks and some ran restaurants. This was a place they called the Noodle Joint at the corner of Liberty and Ferry. It was run by Wah Hong over on the right there with the teapot. Hong came to Oregon in 1882, and he's 47 in this photo. He was fluent in English, and his restaurant was a popular hangout for Chinese and whites. In 1902, a fire broke out and nearly destroyed the place. The local paper said, for a time, there were hopes that the entire colony would be wiped out. The district is the most despicable eyesore which Salem is now cursed with. Hong was still running the place in the 1920s and died in 1933. He was 83 and is buried in the Salem Pioneer Cemetery. So some were able to bring over their wives and families. These were the merchants. Some married here and they had children, and their children achieved just by being born here, something their parents could only dream about. The late 1800s kept many Chinese children from attending public schools in many communities in the West. In Salem, though, the children were able to integrate into the city's schools. In 1887, the Statesman editor said, under the laws of this state, Chinese children are entitled to the same free public school privileges as white, black, or brown children. Several children in Marion County of Chinese parents regularly attend public school as they do in Astoria and presumably in Portland. In 1906, our governor, George Chamberlain, said, the West is opposed to joint occupancy of public schoolrooms by Japanese or Chinese and our white children. And the Statesman said again, right here in Salem, for some years, Chinese children have enjoyed the privilege of our public schools without a single protest. They're well treated by the other schools, are bright and well behaved. The tendency is to overlook their color and the shape of their eyes and to allow them to learn our language, adapt our ways, and become Americanized. Lo Sun Fook was called Hop Lee by Salem's white citizens. He came over in 1877 when he was 19. He worked as a cook and a construction worker before running a laundry in 1885, the Hop Lee Laundry on Commercial in Chemeketa. After this, he owned a fresh poultry and fish market on Ferry Street. He learned English well, most likely at the Chinese Baptist Mission, which was a part of the First Baptist Church. They met 4 evenings a week for Sunday school in the afternoon, and they had a minister who was fluent in Chinese and English. It was the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography. You paid $1 a month, and the program had up to 40 students at a time. Salem had 2 Christian Chinese missions, one Baptist and one Presbyterian. It's hard to overemphasize how important these Christian missions were to the Chinese because they learned to speak English there, and they learned many of the cultural norms. And fluency was the key to success at that time in Salem's white society. So in 1903, Hop Lee, or Lo Sun Fook, was single, 46 years old and doing well financially and fluent in English. He married to his left there. And she was a citizen born in this country, so they were able to buy 612 acres in the Clear Lake area north of Salem from a local farmer, Alva Smith. Smith got a lot of grief from his neighbors for selling land to a Chinese. They grew hops. They collected 125 cords of wood every year for their own heating and cooking needs. They lived on 13th and State, raised 10 children, and he died in 1925 at the age of 68, and he was buried on his own farm. Bulwalcum on the left here came to the US in 1876 when he was 27. He had a traditional Chinese medicine practice on Liberty Street dating since 1886. He was one of Oregon's best known Chinese herbal doctors of the time, along with Chan Jiwo of Portland and Ing He of John Day. He was one of Salem's official representatives of the 6 companies governing body in San Francisco, along with George Sun on the right here. Bulwalcum's medical practice and herb store was used by both Chinese and white patients in Salem. He openly advertised his abilities. I carry all kinds of Chinese drugs, medicines, roots, herbs, nature's remedies, good for the blood and kidneys. I cure all kinds of female diseases, stomach trouble, piles, and chronic diarrhea. Despite his abilities, medical care in the late 1800s in Salem for seriously ill Chinese residents was challenging. Although Willamette University enrolled its first medical students in 1867, the first city hospital didn't open until 1896, and most Chinese laborers couldn't afford to see a white physician. They saw Dr. Kum and other Chinese doctors for most of their medical needs. 4 out of the 5 leading causes of death at the time were infectious diseases, and tuberculosis and typhoid took their toll on the Chinese. There wasn't specific or effective treatment for those conditions at that time other than supportive therapy. Bulwalcum was a complicated character. In the back of his herbal medicine store, he ran a gambling and opium operation. It was used by both Chinese and Caucasians. He was a gambler himself, and the stories say that he gambled away a lot of the wealth he'd accumulated. He died in 1910 and was buried in the Salem Pioneer Cemetery along with his wife. George Lai Sun came here in 1868 when he was 19. He was known as the mayor of Chinatown, and he was an official 6 companies representative in Salem. He worked his way up from a laborer. He was fluent in English. In 1883, he married King Leong, 11 years younger, from China. He ran the city laundry and the Bennett House until it burned down in 1887, and Sun and his wife barely escaped. After that, he set up a General Mercantile, the George Sun Company, located on State Street. His store was really a community center for the Chinese. That's where they eventually had to register following the Geary Act of 1892 that required all Chinese to carry a certificate of residency or risk being deported. In 1922, he was invited to speak at the 50th birthday celebration of Hal Patton, who was a prominent white Salem businessman. To paraphrase what he said, "When I first came to Salem in 1868, this was a small town, not many stores, and the streets were awfully muddy. Then I stayed here for so long and got acquainted with everybody. Hal was a little child, but I knew him very well, and he came to my store often, and we were good friends. I went back to China twice. The first time to get married, I couldn't bring my wife back because I had no certificate. Then I made a certificate, went back to bring my wife here 35 years ago. My children all went through school, some through college. I like Salem because all the people treated me nicely. My children have all grown up and they can vote. I've been here for so long, for 54 years next June. I ought to be a citizen. I ought to be voting too. I see some come over here to this country who've been here only 3 or 4 years and they can vote. Why have I been here 54 years altogether and still cannot vote? I ought to be a citizen too. They must have made a mistake. Something's wrong." So George Lai Sun lived on South Church Street, where he and his wife raised 7 children. In addition to his store, he had a truck garden ranch south of Salem. Several disastrous fires, unaffordable lease costs, condemnation by the city, and relentless institutional racism led to the decline and gradual disappearance of our Chinatown. In 1925, George Sun and his family, after the last of the Chinatown buildings were demolished, moved to Portland, where he died in 1932, and he's buried in Portland's Lincoln Memorial Park. So Salem's Chinatown thrived for about 50 years, but eventually became extinct. We know of no direct descendants of Salem's early Chinese pioneers are still living in the city. Chinese make up less than 1% of our population now. But when you go into the local Chinese grocery store, the seafood market, the barbershop or restaurants, you can still hear them speaking Toisan just like they did 150 years ago. We'll always have a connection with Salem's past. So thank you. And next, Juwen Zhang, professor of Chinese studies at Willamette, will discuss the more recent Asian immigrants to Salem and some of the issues we face today.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you all. Particularly, I want to thank the organizers for this event. My panelists already talked about the Chinese in Salem from archaeological, archival, and the historical perspectives. And today I would like to share some of my thoughts. I would say not well thought, but I would like to share these ideas to understand mostly on these few points. I will touch upon these aspects, but may not be able to expand on all of them. First of all, we already heard that Chinese came to Salem mostly for job, during the railroad construction and the gold rush. But then we also noticed that Salem, by 1920s to 30s, hundreds of early Chinese workers left Salem. And then we also see that a new wave of Chinese coming to Salem in 1960s or after 1960s. And we also know, as a common sense, that the historical legal changes in this country and in the world. So we have to keep thinking what would sustain the Chinese community in a place like Salem or Beaverton, Portland, or elsewhere in the United States or elsewhere in the world. That is the big migration issue and ethnicity. So I would also touch upon a little bit about today's situation. While we all know the facts, we have to think about the roots of the problem. Unless we know where these ideas hate from, we couldn't really find a cure to that. What I also want to emphasize is that using the Salem's example, we do see hope. We see hope in the sense that the community is getting stronger, bigger, and more integrated into everyday life in Salem, a bigger community. And in particular, since 4 years ago, we had this event, Qing Ming celebration, which is also acknowledged by the city, by the mayor. So we do have the dark history, but I also want to emphasize the bright future we are facing. So with these points I want to start with a little bit of information about the demographic change in Salem. For example, we see in 1860s, there were only 2 Chinese recorded in Salem. Asian Americans in general, total, like this. And then in 1900s, according to the record, there are 235 Chinese in Myron County, and I don't have access to the accurate number of the Chinese in particular. But we somehow get the not very accurate data. That is, in around the 1900s, there were about 12% Chinese in Salem, of the Salem population. As you heard earlier about the cemetery, Salem Pioneer Cemetery, around the 1900s, there were at least 100 more graves. In fact, today we still have 30 graves in the Pioneer Cemetery, marked as Chinese, unknown, without names. Then we also see a change in 1960s when the entire population in Salem reached to almost 50,000, and then Chinese began to come. I don't have the accurate number, but I do have a relatively accurate number today. That is 1,200. And that takes about 0.5%. Well, the total population in Salem is around 175,000. So what I want to see, I want to indicate through these numbers is that the change of migration in relation to occupation and other issues, social issues. As you just heard, about 100 years ago, Chinese was particularly targeted. Here we have an advertisement during that time. This was an advertisement for detergent or washer. So this quote is from the bottom of this poster. And we also have a so-called proverb, no tiki, no washi. That was very typical racial stereotype of a laundryman. So 100 years ago, we see that was the reality. And in particular, Kylie showed some documents about Salem in particular. So with this, I'm trying to think through some of the issues. That is, all those actions we see, driving away Chinese or others, came from some kind of ideology or conception. So we might have to try to figure out who are they, who are us, and then also what brought Chinese or people to Salem, Oregon. As we know, in general, migration has many factors. But I think in our case here, two factors are particularly important: occupation and cultural environment. For example, Chinese came to this country, to California, to Oregon, mostly for gold rush, for railroad, for the sake of make a living. And then because of the cultural environment or social environment, they were kicked out. They couldn't stay because of discrimination and so on. And then if we use the same logic today, we see that we have a large population of Asian Americans in, for example, in Beaverton, where you have Intel and Nike and other companies. So people come to make a living. So that's natural. So basically, occupational and cultural environments are key to migration. And then in this process, we have to ask who has the right and the adaptability to stay. Now, discrimination has to have some kind of a social and ideological root. And in this process, I think earlier my panelists already indicate that in this dark history of the past 100 or 150 years, we see something is missing, something is absent, something is invisible or untellable. So here I would like to remind people these facts that in 1875, the Congress passed this act called the Page Act. It was essentially to ban the migration or coming to the United States of Chinese women. So Chinese women were not allowed to come to the United States through this Page Act. So that was the prelogue of the next movement of the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882.
Juwen,
Yes.
my apologies for interrupting. Would you be able to advance your slides, please? We're only seeing number 2.
Oh. Sorry, let me. Are you able to see the actions are driven by ideology and concept?
Yes, we can see it now. Thank you.
Sorry, something wrong. So here I just mentioned these 3 acts, Asian Exclusion Act in 1924. So these are, I think, are the ideologies or the roots of the expressions that we see, you know, whether through marriage or a business owner and so on. And are you able to see the next slides?
Yes, we can now.
Oh, sorry. Let me do it again. Okay, so then we'll relate to the past to today's phenomenon. I would call that as really a scar, a virus, in terms of anti-Asian American. And Salem is just minimized miniature of this whole society. What we see in Salem is also something happened in other places in Oregon. For example, Baker City, John Day, Portland, Salem, Medford, and other places in the United States. Recently, we also, you know, Portland had several events of protest, you know, about anti-Asian American hate. And then recent days, weeks, we also had an incident where a Willamette female student was beaten by 2 white men for no reason, perhaps, except for the color. So as you also know that there's a website which collects reports about anti-Asian American hate. So far, there are about 4,000 cases reported, and 40 of them are from Oregon. But I am very confident that there are many other incidents that are not reported, and I know some of those already. Back to the question of what can hold a community. You know, for example, we see in Salem, do we have more businesses owned by Asian American, Chinese American? Are there enough job opportunities for Asian American or Chinese American, and so on? I'm not saying that you know, Chinese presence must be in proportion in anything, but I'm saying that the occupation and the cultural environment, particularly those two, are crucial in terms of creating the environment for anyone to stay, whether Chinese or African or whoever. But we have to understand that this hate, this discrimination is not a born nature of human being. In other words, I think no one is born a racist and no one is born a terrorist. In that regard, we have to dig the root of the racism. As you know, even in English, the word race or race has only 500-year history. So clearly, this ideology is the root of the past 500 years in terms of implementing this ideology through colonialization and other legal issues. So what I also want to bring attention to is that what brings a community together is our shared life experience, migration, and the culture is like people. There's no pure thing. The idea of a pure is very racist itself. So it is the shared experience, life style, and interest of life, everyday life that bring us together. So here I would like to use the quote from Frederick Douglass, who said that they divided both to conquer each. I guess many people already know this. They refers to the masters of the slaves, and both. This both means the poor white, the regular white, and the black. This, here. This actually is from 1866. Think about what Kylie, in particular, Kylie and Myron mentioned. During that time, how discrimination against Asian or Chinese was practiced in Salem. And here we see along the East Coast where people talk about racism, the root of racism. So with that, I want to finally bring hope to our life. That is, we have to teach the children, our children, the history. I think we should start from a very beginning. That is a public school curriculum, elementary school curriculum. For example, picture book, children's book, to let them know the history. And then unite us with a common shared experience and the lifestyle. And then we need to find the root of the problem. So I think we may, right now there's a danger, there's a trap that some people categorically saying the white, the black, the yellow, and so on. This actually is further divide these groups. We have to recognize there are good people everywhere among any group, culture group. There are also bad people. Bad, I mean, they insist on this racist ideas. So, and I'm also hopeful that things like what happened in Salem about Qing Ming will happen in other places as we learn more about the history in different locations. Finally, I want to share just these few images. Maybe you all already know because these are from website. But I think we have to think more about the racism as a virus. And the recent times, Times have this cover, and the New Yorker has this. And we see this is not just about Asian American, but this is something for all those who are discriminated. We are no longer silent. And this is something I would like to end with Obama's conversation. This is a post in YouTube. Obama tried to answer a question, what is the cure for racism? Here are not the accurate quote, but I want to just highlight that he suggests that we need to educate children about history. We need to reach out to people who are not like us. And the white people do not feel overly defensive. This is exactly what I just want to say, that we should not categorically say black and white and yellow and so on. So we have to find the root of the problem. And the very last, I want to offer a folklorist point of view that even to the people who who are different from us, who have different opinion from us, we should ask them or ask ourselves to make sense of nonsense. Thank you.
Thank you, Juwen. I'd like to invite Jackie Peterson-Loomis back on.
Let me ask a question, Tracy. Do you think we need to go straight to Q&A, or do we have time to go back through the panelists again to reflect on one another's contributions here?
I think you should do that, Jackie. I think that'd be an interesting conversation.
Okay, so the premise here, as I suggested earlier, is that getting at the history of racism itself is really, I mean, that's a bigger topic, and this whole question of whiteness is, it's so fundamental, and yet I think there's so much work to do, even at the fundamental level of helping people understand these other histories in such a way that that level of respect and understanding can be brought to the table. I don't think that this is really about sense of guilt or somehow feeling superior to, but rather being able to feel equal to. And that is, just to a large degree, I think depends upon people's ability to take in as information and to fully understand the complexity and the contributions of Asian Americans throughout American history. So I wanted all of these panelists to sort of think about and talk about what they think these 4 different perspectives can help us understand perhaps more fully about what we know and what we don't know and should know, want to know about the Chinese experience, in particularly in Salem for this program. I'm going to start with Kimberli.
So I'll take a start. So I would begin by saying that to me, I mean, I was trained as a city planner first in my career, and it was actually only during this project that I finished my later in life education to become an archaeologist. And if you would have asked me in early 2017, the same question that the Landmarks Commission posed to me, I would have said, no, Salem didn't have a Chinatown. We didn't have any significant Chinese community here in Salem. And through this project and the collaborative nature of it and the invaluable help from so many different people, just a few of which are here today. So in particular, you know, of course, Kylie and Myron and Juwen, they all brought their different perspectives, and Kylie's expertise and fantastic skill as a researcher helped us to do that more traditional research, but also with that lens of, you know, looking, like she explained, looking at maps and looking especially at newspaper articles, and even Ben Maxwell, who I definitely heard about. We even, you know, have an award at the city named after him, but he was actually a racist. So, you know, that's made me take a bit of a pause and be like, maybe we need to rethink the name of that award, but that's for another day. It was exciting that Juwen also went to Penn, as I did, and I didn't know that. And so he had done some work in Philadelphia in a cemetery. And so my first big project was in a cemetery here in Salem. And one of the things, you know, wearing the different hats that I do, I also was able to discover that all of the community engagement techniques and tools that I've used throughout my career actually really work well with archaeological projects too. So to me, that was a really critical part of this project, is involving the Chinese community. I would never have met Myron, and Myron actually saved me from myself. I was all excited to go to China, and I was going to go without a guide, not knowing Chinese. And you know, he had described to me his journey back to China to rediscover his home village. So I learned a lot from him as an individual, and he helped me figure out my plan a little bit better. And then of course I connected also to Chelsea Rose, who's done some fantastic work in Southern Oregon University. So I continue to learn so much, I think, about what I don't know yet, which as historians always do that, you know, you dig more and there's more to come. So I'm hopeful that I'm left with hope. I am very proud of our city leadership right now, and especially how they stepped up and continue to step up even this year with the mayor making a most recent proclamation about Qing Ming and that commitment to our Chinese community. But I don't think it's enough. I feel like we need to keep doing more and shedding light on not just the history, but also about what's happening now. So yeah, I learned a lot.
Kylie.
I think I've been most appreciative by the collaborative aspect that Kimberli's kind of brought folks to the table through this advisory committee, and being able to draw on the expertise of everybody else. I mean, I did a biographical research on one of the burials in the Salem Pioneer Cemetery and got to meet with Juwen, who looked at the characters and was able to give me more information about what was going on, which I would never have been able to do myself because I don't have those language skills. And to hear all of the work that Myron's done too, researching through the community and finding these stories that, yeah, it just ways to be able to understand and make this story more complete, and also share it with the community, and how special it is to be a part of this series and be able to hear what other things are going on, to be able to provide some of that contextual information from around the state and see how our community is different and similar to other communities throughout Oregon. And I think it's been pretty special too to see how it's being played out today in the ceremony and reinstating a historical ceremony. And I'm a living history person. That's a big thing to me, is this idea. And this isn't just a reenactment, it's an actual opportunity to bring that tradition back and to celebrate and another public entrance point to a really meaningful part of this community history. So yeah, yay for collaboration. Thank you all for sharing your skills and talents and thoughts with us too.
Thank you, Kylie. Myron.
I think without Kimberli and Kylie, there would be no project, and we would have known still nothing about this. When I went to Willamette for 4 years, and in my 30 years being a physician in town here, would not have known any of this history about Salem without the catalyst of the archaeological discovery and then the further research. So they've done such a fantastic job, and the Chinese community is incredibly grateful for that, that this history hasn't been lost. I was struck in looking at the stories of these individuals, probably, it reminded me of the early Chinese community in Portland, the one that was on 2nd Street, so much of that history has been lost because these are people that came in the 1870s and 1880s, and much of that history is lost in Portland now. And so it's hard to find real history, and it's always nearly impossible to find stories that are written in their own language or anything like that. So being able to put some of these things together to bring these people to life again has been really kind of exciting. And yeah, we hope that people like the laborer Jim Chung and other characters won't be forgotten in the future. So I'm really glad to be a small part of this, working among professionals.
Thank you, Myron. Your work is exemplary, and really want to congratulate you on really, really extraordinarily fine work you're doing. So let's hear from Juwen.
Well, I have the same feeling. Without Kimberli's initiative, we won't be here for this project. Well, when I first came to Salem in 2002, actually the first thing I tried to find out is about the Pioneers Cemetery, because my dissertation was about the funeral, a Chinese funeral in Philadelphia. So I realized there were Chinese buried there, but I never did more than that, just knowing the fact. But recently I've tried to think about the issue from different perspective. That is what is going on today, as you asked earlier. I think what we are repeating about 100 years ago, is very much superficially, very much due to the fact that jobs. Think about 100 years ago when the railroad was over, gold rush was, those things. It was the blame was the Chinese took our jobs. Therefore, we should kick them out. And today we see the same rhetoric. Chinese took our jobs. But I think today we have an extra layer that is the political dimension. After McCarthyism, this anti-China is not just about anti-Chinese culture, anti-Chinese history, but rather with the political intention. But to a folklorist, I think it's interesting to see the recycled narratives in many ways. So I think, as people say, if you can't face yourself, you blame others. So this is what we see, because we can't face ourselves, we can't face our own history, then we end up this. So the logic is we have to face ourselves, face our history, then we will be better. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Juwen. I want to thank you too for the quote from Frederick Douglass. You've made me feel now that I'm going to be doing the next month's session in this series about old Chinatown primarily. And I think I might invite one or two other people to talk about it, but I think I do also want to end on this note of really what we're dealing with now, because I think it is a resurgence, quite frankly, of what happened before and directly after the Civil War. We're not done with this topic, and we're not done with American only meaning as a code word, or white being a code word for American. I mean, it's not just the Asian American issue. I mean, it's much bigger than that, and it's very frightening. And so I think these conversations are essential, and that people like you and everyone in the audience here, are the people who need to be able to develop your voices and your courage in such a way to begin to address something that is pretty formidable for all of us. So I thank you so much for everything that you've had to contribute today. And it's a great foundation. I want to suggest that in the coming months, we're going to be hearing from Jacksonville, from Astoria, from the Dalles, from Pendleton, from John Day. It's a very, very exciting time, I think, for being able to share this, and hopefully, that education piece will at least have some impact. Some of these forces are bigger than that, but this is really a start, and hopefully a start within the more rural areas of this state. So I think from here, do we have time for Q&A?
We have just a few minutes, Jackie, and we are answering lots of questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Well, maybe do you want to pick out one big one, or do you want me to go on and make the announcements and closing remarks, whatever works for you?
Maybe I'll open it up to the panelists and see if there was any one particular question that you'd like to reflect on.
I'll just jump in. I just want to say to anyone who's listening, who's interested in participating or helping us, again, as I mentioned, this work, in some ways I feel like we're just beginning. If you are interested, you can email me. I think I put my email in the chat because we do have a committee that's continuing to work and do research and identify goals. And this is the committee that helps put together that the Qing Ming Festival every year. So please contact me if you have an interest.
Thank you, Kimberly. And Jackie, if you'd like to close us out today, please.
I will. And I think just before I get to the closing remarks, I want to recognize, I don't know if she's still with us, but we have a major scholar, Chinese American scholar of Chinese American history, Su Fan Chong, from the University of Nevada. And if she's still with us, I want to recognize also Mei Yi, who is the first Chinese American woman to have been elected to the state legislature. She's one of our celebrities. So I'm really thrilled by the number of people who signed in for today. And if you enjoyed this program, you can stay tuned for the third program, which will be in late May, which I will be moderating, or myself. I mean, I will figure out how that works, but it'll be a chance for us to share what we have begun to learn about Portland, Chinatown, which was the largest Chinatown in Oregon. And it probably does provide an opportunity to explore some ideas that we've developed and sort of use them as a way to sort of test that model in other communities. So we'll get to that next month. I also want to point out that we have a very exciting event, actually several events in May for Asian American Heritage Month. And this is the Portland premiere of Chinese American well-known playwright Lauren Yi, called The Great Leap, which is about basketball, but it's also about Tiananmen Square. I mean, it's an international, very, very powerful script, and it's going to be a series of virtual readings, which sounds like that's kind of boring, but in fact, it's like watching a movie with these close-ups, these intimate close-ups of the actors who are all professional actors with a backdrop of motion pictures. So I strongly urge you to get your tickets. It's we'll have 7 performances between May 1 and May 9th, and there are talkbacks, live talkbacks after the virtual readings with various cast members and the playwright herself. So we really urge you to get your tickets now. I think that's sort of it. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and look forward to seeing you the next time. Okay.